Hello, my name is Alan, and this is the second in our series of onboarding videos. Today, what we're going to discuss is the company profile, the company settings, and the invoice settings. To give you an example of what I'm talking about here, what I'm going to do is open up a standard invoice from Workshop software. So, if we have a look at this invoice, what we have up here is the fact that it is a tax invoice. We have the date, we have the job number, we have the MVRL, which is the license repairer's number. Down here, we have the taxation number for the business, the full address in a nice clean format, which is very, very easy and clean to read. Contact details for the workshop, mobile number if required, the email address, and also the website. Second section down here is we have the customer details, and as you can see, we have the full address, and we have both a landline and a mobile number to get in touch with the customer for. In here, we have the registration details of the vehicle. Down in this section over here, we have a description of the work of the parts that were sold and the labor that was used on this particular job. And then further down in the invoice, we have the full description of what was done on the vehicle. And finally, down at the bottom, what we have are the banking details for the business or the workshop, right? So that your customer can pay you via EFT, for example, right? Now that we've had a good look at that, right, I'm about to show you how you would actually set up all of this information so that it comes out on your standard invoices. So what I'm going to do is just close out of that for the moment. And the first thing we're going to do is come up into the upper right quadrant to the welcome window here. And this is where we go into the company profile. In the company profile, the first thing that you can do is you can add an icon or a logo for your business, right? Typically, you would have that saved on your hard drive somewhere. And we recommend that the format should be JPEG or PNG or GIF file, right? There is a size limitation of 2 megabytes. And the recommended dimensions for the logo would be 300 pixels via 300 pixels. The most important thing to remember there is it's 300 to 310 pixels high. If you have a rectangular logo, that will be no problem at all, as long as you don't exceed 310 pixels in height. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my hard drive where I have one of these. I go to Choose Image. There is my logo right here, and as we can see, it's a rectangle. So I click on that, I open it. Now, because it's a rectangle, it looks a little bit crunched up because this is a square window in here. I then go Upload. I should see an Upload Successful sign at the top of the window, and that means that this logo is now installed on my invoices. The next elements that we need to look at would be the name of the business, all right, and your address. So if I come in here, for example, let's say that this is the address of my business. I could come in here and put the address in like this. What we would probably recommend is that you make it as neat as possible. So what you do is you cut out the street address and you put that in here. Clean that up slightly. And the other point that we would probably recommend is that because you do this once, right, spend a little bit of effort and a little bit of time and just make it as nice and neat as possible because you're never going to have to do it again, right? The next thing we need to do is put in a telephone number. And if you're using a landline, right, the system will automatically format your telephone number for a landline. In other words, it will put in the area code and it will put in the digits and format them correctly. If you had a mobile number, for example, right, it will also format your mobile number as a mobile number itself. If you have a fax number, you would put it in here. If you have an email address for the business, then you would actually put that in here. So that might be smartsgarage@hotmail.com.au, right? Whatever your email is, you just put that in there. We would probably recommend that you also copy your email address and put it into your admin email and also in the reply to email address. Now, the reason why the reply to email address is probably the most important of all the emails because you can issue a lot of emails from within Workshop software to both customers and to suppliers. And quite often, if your customer or your supplier's inbound email server doesn't see a reply to email address, it will suspect that the email is spam and the email may not actually go through to the correct person, right? So we always recommend that you do have a reply to email address in the system. In here, we can put in our web address. So I'm going to come in there and click on that. There we have it. For the Australian and New Zealand customer base, right, we would say use English UK as the standard language. If you're an international client, we would say use English US, all right? And that will format the system according to those two particular regimens, so to speak, right? So English US, for example, that will give you all the states that are in the US and Canada and internationally. And English UK will give you everything that's in Australia and New Zealand, right? The next button, which is available for you here, is to acquire SMSs. So if you're looking to get in touch with your customer base via SMS to inform them of an upcoming service or to remind them that their vehicle is now finished and ready for pickup, you can actually do that from within Workshop software using SMSs. So the process for buying SMSs is as follows. Right? You click on the buy SMS button. You have three different pricing levels. They're between $100 and $499, $500 to $5,000, $5,000 and more. Generally, we recommend that for the smaller workshops, right, the middle pricing tier would probably be sufficient for purpose. And if you came in here, the example that I tend to use is that if I were to buy 499 of them, they would cost me $74.85. If I were to buy one more, which would be 500, the price would go down to $65, right? And that is the difference between the first pricing tier and the second pricing tier. The important thing to remember about SMS messages is that when you acquire them, they never expire. So whether you use them in 6 months, 12 months, a year and a half will make no difference, right? The SMS count will simply go down as you use them, all right? And you don't have to worry about any expiration date on them. When you're ready to acquire your SMSs, you simply come in here, you type in the amount that you'd like to acquire, you hit agree to purchase, and then the buy button, and whichever way you paid for your Workshop software subscription, that is how you will get debited for your SMSs. All right, that takes care of the SMSs. Now, the referral code is a nice feature in Workshop software because it's where we get an opportunity to give back a little bit to our customer base. If you happen to have another workshop that you know or somebody else who you feel could benefit from using Workshop software, if you recommend that they sign up for a free trial and you give them the referral code, then you'll get a discount on your subscription for a period of time, and so will your associate or friend who actually signs up for the software. So the referral code can actually be a very nice little benefit just in terms of reducing your subscription cost a little bit for a period. Right, so when everything has been done, right, we simply come in here and we save the profile. And there we have it. Okay, that is all nice and neat now, and that's going to put a fair whack of information into your invoice, right, which will be actually very visible for all of your customers. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to come over to the left-hand side. Under Settings, we're going to go to Company Settings. Now, this is the Company Settings page, right? In here is where you would put your taxation number if you are required to have a taxation or business registration number on all of your invoices. In Australia, for example, you do have to have, it's a legal requirement to have an ABN number, all right, on all of your documents if you're issuing legally binding invoices, right? So this is where you would come in and put in your ABN. So we recommend that for purposes of making the invoice look as neat and professional looking as possible, space things out so that they look nice and neat, very easy to read. If for any reason you need to have a motor vehicle repairer's license as part of your legal documentation, then that's where you would come in and put this information. So I'm just going to type in an MVRL there, all right, and that will appear on my invoices as well. For everyone who is using SMSs, this is the documentation or the field which will identify for your customers when they receive an SMS who the SMS is coming from. All right. In this particular instance, we're going to use smarts as the identifier simply because we have a limitation of 10 characters on this field. All right. So if you have a very long business name, you may need to break it down into an acronym or some shortened form of the business name so that people will recognize where it's coming from. The time zones, right, are going to be completely dependent on where you're located. All right, you have a 24-hour time clock in here, which will work worldwide, and you simply pick the time zone that you belong in. In this particular instance, we're in Australia. We're on Eastern Standard Time, so we click on that, and this calibrates the system for our time zone. The next thing we're going to look at is the product settings. So the product settings, the first of them is you need to set a default labor type, which will be used in your booking diary. If you're planning on using the booking diary, it will give you a default labor type and give you 1 hour's worth of time for the booking diary. So the default can be labor, all right? Quite often when I'm setting up a workshop software system, I differentiate between repair labor and service labor. Service labor will trigger a service reminder automatically for my customers, and repair labor won't. All right. So quite often I just choose repair labor as the default labor code. All right. In this particular instance, I will just leave labor here for the moment. All right. Reserved stock is a feature of workshop software which enables a workshop to set aside products for an upcoming service or job that is going to be done on a vehicle. And what that essentially does is it reserves the stock so that no one else can actually use it in the interim between now and when you actually start the job. All right. What that essentially does is create a scenario where the stock is reserved for the job that you're going to be working on. All right. And if you only had one oil filter, for example, and you had reserved that, if another mechanic came in before that job had started and wanted the same oil filter, he would find that there were none in stock. All right. And therefore he would have to order new ones from the supplier. Right. So reserved stock can be turned on simply by turning that on like that. I'm not going to do that at this point. All right. I'm just going to leave that like that. All right. There are two methods of costing products within workshop software. All right. One is the current cost, which will always show you the latest cost for anything that you've acquired from a supplier. And the second option that you have is average cost. All right. We would recommend that you look up the articles in the help guides and resources, which may give you a little bit more information on the difference between average and current cost. For your information, the most common cost type chosen for workshops tends to be current cost because the price of products never really seems to go down. It always seems to go up. So perhaps it's better to have the current cost being the latest cost, as it's probably the highest. All right, now if we come down into the vehicle settings, right, workshop software offers you a high degree of ability to separate the vehicles and the types of vehicles that you work on. Standard system types is the default for workshop software, and that applies to all current car bodies. All right, so you can have sedans, coupes, hatchbacks, et cetera. But then you also have the choice of various different types of machinery or vehicles that you can work on. So, for example, you could be a workshop that works with both standard system types, but also does a lot of work with agricultural machines. So you can simply pick that. You may also do work on motorcycles. You can pick those. And for each one of these vehicle groups you choose, you will then get body types which are relevant especially to those particular body types, right? So you go agricultural machinery, motorcycles, all right, standard system types. You may also have large trucks that you deal with, which are prime movers and articulated trucks, and then perhaps light commercial vehicles, which are trucks, but they're smaller trucks, not quite the size of prime movers. The next thing that we would recommend that you do is put in a default service interval for your vehicles. In many cases, that will be either 6 months or 12 months, depending on the service regimen from within your workshop or the defined service regimen from the manufacturer of the vehicles. A point to remember is that default service intervals are simply that. They're just defaults. If a vehicle is entered into the system and you do not put in a specific service interval, then the system will default to 12 months or whatever number you put in here. The same applies to your customers. You can have a default method of contact for most of your customers. That could be email, it could be SMS. You may have some customers who prefer that you only get in touch with them via documents. All right, as opposed to emails or SMSs. And you may get the occasional customer who turns around and says, no, please don't get in touch with me. I'll come to you when I'm ready. All right. the default tends to be either email or SMS. So in this particular instance, I'm going to leave email. Now, if we have more than one vehicle body group, right, then I would turn on the advanced vehicle fields. And this enables you in a vehicle record to actually go up into the top right-hand corner and choose the particular type of vehicle group that you're working with. And then it will change the default body types for that vehicle group. In the case where you have a fleet customer and the customer refers to their vehicles by a fleet code number as opposed to the registration number, you would simply turn on the fleet code field. That makes another field available for you in the vehicle record, and you can search for the vehicle using the fleet code number as well as the registration number. All right, so I'm going to leave that off for the moment. The next thing we're going to do is look at the booking settings. The booking settings are the booking settings for your booking diary. So you will come down in here and go, the shop opens at whatever time it opens, it closes at whatever time it closes. The way that you choose those things is PM is down at the bottom, and you choose the time that you want. Simply come in there and go, for example, if the shop closed at 5:30, and in the morning, you come in here, the AM section is up at the top. You may open at 7:45 for your first booking. Right, so you just simply choose that. And then you also have to choose how many mechanics you have working on the floor. The standard that we tend to work with is an 8-hour working day. So we would say that if we had one mechanic in the workshop, we would have a default of 8 hours per day. All right, if you have two, right, then you would simply change that over to 16. And again, this is completely down to your preference. Some workshops work on the basis of a 7.8-hour working day. Some work on an 8.5-hour working day. So the choices are completely yours. This is simply how you would set it up in order to be able to book out the maximum amount of hours for the maximum amount of mechanics that you have in the workshop. All right. Now, if we go show all shop for month, what we do is in the booking diary, we will have one window. And to show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to come in here. All right, I'm going to go into the booking diary. And as we can see, we have one circle. So if I had one mechanic and I booked him out for the whole amount of the day, that circle would completely fill up with color. If I had two mechanics and each of them were working half of the day, then the circle would be half full of color. All right. While this is a good way of looking at the overall view of the workshop, I find it slightly limiting insofar as I may have mechanics who are specialized in a certain type of work. And what I'd like to do is be able to see for myself which mechanics who have specializations, for example, have how much time they have available. All right. The other thing that this particular view will not show you is it will not show you any unassigned bookings that you have on any given day. So I'm going to come back into the company settings. I'm going to change that over to show all shop for month, and I will have two mechanics and 16-hour days. I will save that for a moment. And if we go back into the booking diary, what we will see is we'll see that we have separate circles for each mechanic. So there is Bill Bloggs, for example. There's Harry Newbold. There's Joe the mechanic. And lastly, we have Mike the mechanic. And as I mentioned earlier, right, some of these mechanics may be specialists. And when you book out a specialist, for example, you always want to see whether or not he has any available time in upcoming days, or just generally within the workshop, it shows you the activity level of each of your mechanics on any given day. So I'm going to come back into the company settings. That takes care of that. I would always turn on the description to job status comment. Right? The very simple reason for doing that is that it provides more transparency and more information when you are looking at various different parts of workshop software, such as the Job Center. Right? That tends to show you exactly what is going on in the workshop on any given job. So I tend to turn that on. I'm going to save that for the moment. The next thing we look at is the tax settings for the business. Now, in Australia, for example, we have a 10% GST, so that's 10% GST on purchases and 10% GST on sales. In various different parts of the world, you have different tax rates, and the tax rates are going to be applicable as per your tax regime in your particular area. The next point we come to is prices as to whether or not they include or exclude tax. So on an invoice line, for example, if I have a filter and the filter sells for $10, but with GST, it sells for $11. My choice is whether or not I show that it costs $11 on the invoice or whether I show that it costs $10 and it adds the GST at the bottom of the invoice, right? If you want that, you would have $11 would be this option here. $10 would be here with a $1 GST added at the bottom. All right, so I'll leave that on for the moment. On tax on freight, it's more a matter of whether or not I actually choose to add freight as an additional cost to the customer. If I have to pay freight on anything large that I've brought in to for a customer's particular job, like for example, an axle or a transmission or an engine block or something like that, where I have a separate freight charge. All right, the freight on normal goods and services tends to be built into the to the profit margin for that particular product and may not be actually separately added on as a tax on freight. All right, this is really for more or less specialized purchases and specialized freight costs for distinct items, right? The rounding total. So I would generally tend to say, yes, I'd turn that on. The rounding total is the easiest way to explain rounding totals for customers who have been using accounting systems for running their workshops is that this is a button which will apply to supplier invoices. And the easiest example is that if a supplier provides me with an invoice and the invoice says that it's $30.98, and I enter those items into Workshop software, because Workshop software rounds out to the fourth decimal place, it may turn around at the end and say that the invoice is actually worth $30.99. All right. This is not a situation which I would like or I would find very convenient because it's going to go across into my accounting system, and it's also going to record that the invoice value in Workshop software is different than what the supplier has given me. So turning on the rounding total allows you to have a little field down at the bottom of the supplier invoice, which allows you to make a 1 or 2 cent adjustment on any given invoice so that it matches what the supplier has actually sent to you. Very important. And now, discount includes tax. If for any reason you do apply discounts for your customers, generally you would want to include the tax on those, all right? Simply because there's no particular reason why you should lose revenue and not calculate the tax on the loss of revenue as well. So we would always say that you should turn on discount includes tax, yes. Right, these are the primary settings for your company settings. All right, so we've gone through all of those. I'm going to save that at the moment. And as you should know by now, you always want to see the green bar at the top of the page when you save something in Workshop software. That indicates that everything that you've done on the page is acceptable. And if there's a red bar at the top, generally the field where there is an error will be bordered in red. So you know where to start looking for the error that needs to be corrected. The next section we're going to look at is the invoice settings. And in here, we have quite a few choices that are available for you. First of all, there are a multitude of different formats which you can choose for your invoicing. All right, they tend to be the default, which is where a lot of people start with Workshop software. And then there's print labor style, which will provide you the information in a slightly different format on the invoice. There is the option of using letterhead printed paper, right? And that will therefore actually change the format of the invoice and allow for a letterhead. Notes at top tends to be where the description of what was done on the customer's job for that day comes up above the financial information on the invoice. Because some workshops tend to work on the premise that they would like the customer to read what has been done for them first before they actually start to look at the financial elements of the invoice. Print original is very much the same as the default invoice, except that it goes that you have a box or a border around all of your major fields, as opposed to a shaded area which you get on the default. All right. Print stretched is simply another format for the top of the invoice where you can actually bring your logo all the way across the top of the page if you'd like. All right. So those are your different choices. And in later videos, we will actually go through some of these. What we do recommend is when you're starting to use Workshop software, start with a default invoice, for example, process or save a customer invoice, and then come back into the company invoice settings and then just change the format around and reprint the invoice. All right. That will give you a view of how it changes, and you can work through these until you find the format that is preferential for your particular workshop. All right. So I'm going to leave that at default for the moment. The next thing that we need to do is to come and look at the default terms that are going to be on all of your invoices. For the most part, workshops tend to work on the premise that everything is cash on delivery, and certain account customers, right, will have different payment terms. Those payment terms can be specified for the customer in the customer record, right? The default tends to usually be cash on delivery, and this will print out on every single invoice, right? Unless you are an account customer, in which case the terms which you've been allowed will be the terms which print out on your invoice. The next thing I would do is, these are just recommendations for you, right? But we would recommend that you hide the part numbers on your invoices, because while you may be able to see them on the screen, there's no particular reason why your customer needs to see them on his invoice. Unless you do have specific customers, such as some of the trucking companies, for example, would want to see that you are actually using bona fide genuine parts, all right? In which case, the only way they confirm that is by sitting there and seeing the actual part number from the truck supplier or the truck parts supplier. The next option that we would turn around and recommend is that the job number should be the same as the invoice number. An invoice in workshop software always starts off as a job, whether that's from a booking or whether it's just starting an invoice itself, right? It only truly becomes an invoice at the point in time where the invoice is actually processed, right? Until then, it remains as a job. But because jobs can sometimes take quite a few days to actually go work their way through the system, right? You'll sometimes turn around and say the job number should remain the same as the invoice number all the way through, so that you keep all of your documentation nice and linear and clean to understand. So we would turn that on. The next recommendation we would use is hide the tire details on the job card. There are templates which you can use in workshop software which are provided for you, and they will allow you to actually put in the tire details on a job card without necessarily taking up all of the real estate on the job card itself, right? I will show that to you at a later point in time. So I would say hide the tire details. The next field, which I find very, very important, is to turn on the hours worked field. This shows up on your screen in workshop software in your invoice, and it shows how many hours the mechanics have actually worked on a job, and therefore that enables you to actually put in the correct amount of hours to be charged to the customer, right? So we find that field tends to be very important. Preventing split notes on an invoice is also a very nice way of providing a professional looking invoice. Because what it does is, if you have a long story to tell a customer about what was done on their vehicle that day, you don't necessarily want it coming across the bottom of the first page and then across the top of the second page. It's probably a little bit better and a little bit more professional looking if it remains in its own nice little box and it prints out on the second page. All right, it simply looks a little bit better in terms of your presentation. Let's see. That generally would tend to cover most of the things which we believe are important to you when you're first starting to work with workshop software. We do strongly recommend that if you want to, you can go in and change any of these toggles at any time, then do your output again, produce your invoice, have a look at it, and work it out to the point where you're happy with the way that your invoices are looking. All right, there's a great deal of flexibility in this particular section. All right, it allows you to do a whole lot of different things, and it allows you to customize and define your invoices very much the way that you might want to do them, or the way that you're used to doing them. All right, that covers off the end of this particular video. Thank you very much for watching this, and please stay tuned for our next video. Any questions, by the way, that you have relative to what we've covered in this video, you can always look for these things in the help guides and resources. All right, there are a whole series of different topics which you can cover. So if I go invoice choice, for example, I might come in there and look at that, how to change your invoice format, various different articles that you could find, payment terms, for example, how to choose those, how to process a supplier invoice, how to create a company settings explained, right? So all of the things which we've covered in this video are also covered in more detail in articles within the help guides and resources. So thank you very much for having a look at that. And as per usual, we will be sending you a questionnaire. If you could fill out the questionnaire based on what you've watched in this video, that gives us a very, very good insight into how far you've come down the road in terms of learning how to use workshop software. So once again, thank you very much for watching the video, and please stay tuned for the next one.